You've looked at New York Harbor and seen the postcard, the Statue of Liberty, the skyline, a busy stretch of water. What you probably never noticed is that the same harbor is dotted with islands America spent a fortune building up and then simply walked away from. One of them was the front door to the entire country, and it sat rotting for decades. Another guarded New York for 200 years, and the government handed it over for a single dollar. A third holds more than 1 million American bodies, and the sea is slowly washing the bones back out. These weren't worthless rocks. For a long stretch of American history, these were some of the most valuable pieces of ground the country owned. So the real question isn't why nobody lived on them, it's how America ended up abandoning the very islands it once couldn't live without. And the answer comes down to one thing almost nobody thinks about. Start with why an island was ever worth anything in the first place. For most of American history, an island in a harbor had one enormous advantage that no piece of mainland could match. You could control it completely. Nobody walks onto an island by accident. There's no back road, no fence to hop, no way on or off except by boat, past whoever you put in charge. In a world before bridges, before airplanes, before antibiotics, that kind of total control was worth more than gold. If you needed to filter people, defend a city, or lock something dangerous away from everybody else, an island did the job better than anything on solid ground. Isolation was the whole point. Isolation was the asset. And no island cashed in on that harder than Ellis Island. Between 1892 and 1954, more than 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island on their way into America. Picture that number. Something like 4 in 10 Americans alive today can trace a relative back to that one building in the harbor. It was the front door to the whole country, and it worked precisely because it was an island. Every hopeful newcomer got funneled onto that patch of land, inspected, questioned, and either waved through or turned back with no way to slip around the process. The isolation that made it a prison for some was exactly what made it priceless to the government. You couldn't run a filter like that in the middle of Manhattan. You needed water on all sides. Then the ground shifted, and it happened fast. In 1924, Congress slammed the door with a set of strict immigration quotas, and just like that, the flood of newcomers slowed to a trickle. What nobody expected was the second blow. The government started processing immigrant paperwork at American consulates overseas, which meant people were screened before they ever got on the boat. The whole reason Ellis Island existed, that giant island filter in the harbor, suddenly had almost nothing left to filter. The island limped along for years as a detention center and a wartime holding pen, and in November of 1954, the last man was released and the doors closed for good. Here's the part that stuns people. The government just left it there. For the next decade, one of the most historically important buildings in America stood completely empty. Vandals stripped it of everything they could carry, from doorknobs to filing cabinets. Snow blew through the shattered windows, the roofs leaked, weeds pushed up through the floors, and the walls soaked up harbor damp like a sponge. The gateway that welcomed 12 million people rotted in plain sight, close enough to see from the Statue of Liberty. It took until 1990 and a restoration that ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars before the main building reopened as a museum. And even now, roughly 30 other buildings on the island, including the old hospital, are still crumbling behind fences, off limits, and falling apart. Ellis Island wasn't a fluke though. The same story was playing out right across the water. Look at Governor's Island, a few hundred yards off the tip of Manhattan. For more than 200 years, this was one of the longest continuously running military posts in the entire country. George Washington's troops fortified it during the Revolution. The Army ran it as a headquarters from the 1790s all the way to 1966. And then the Coast Guard took over and turned it into the largest base of its kind in the world. A self-contained town with nearly 3,000 people. A school, a hospital, a movie theater, and a church. On the most valuable harbor in America, this island was a fortress the country leaned on for 2 full centuries. And then, modern warfare made the whole idea pointless. Once you've got aircraft, missiles, and a defense budget stretched thin, a fort sitting in a harbor stops being a shield and starts being a bill. By the 1990s, the Coast Guard was staring down a budget gap of $400 million, and shutting this one base down saved them an estimated $30 million. So in 1996, after 200 years, they turned off the lights and left. The island became an instant ghost town. Roughly 100 buildings, with about half of them sliding into decay, empty apartment towers and swimming pools, and a supermarket going quiet a stone's throw from Wall Street. Now here's the number that tells you everything. In 2003, the federal government sold most of Governor's Island to the people of New York for $1. $1. For 150 acres of land with a direct view of the Manhattan skyline, some of the most expensive real estate on planet Earth. That price tag isn't a typo, and it isn't generosity. It's a confession. The government couldn't figure out what to do with the place and wanted out from under it. Which brings up the obvious objection, the one you're probably already thinking. If this is priceless real estate, harbor views and open space right next to the most crowded city in America, why didn't somebody just develop it and make a killing? Slap up some condos, build a resort, print money. That's where the cruel twist comes in. And it's the same twist every single time. The exact thing that made these islands so valuable is the exact thing that makes them almost impossible to reuse. Isolation. An island reachable only by boat is a nightmare to build on. There's no bridge to run trucks and utilities across, no easy way to move materials or people, and the old buildings need millions of dollars a year just to keep them from collapsing. One analysis of the Governor's Island deal laid it out plainly. The island was connected to the mainland only by ferry, and it bled money in maintenance every year just standing still. The mainland always offered a cheaper option, so the same market that would pay a fortune for a Manhattan view won't touch an island with no bridge and 100 rotting buildings. The isolation that made it a perfect fortress made it a perfect money pit. That's the island curse, and it explains the whole pattern. Because it wasn't just immigration and the military. America once used islands for everything it wanted kept at arm's length. When a disease was spreading, the sick got shipped to quarantine islands in the harbor, locked away from the healthy by that same reliable moat of water. It worked! Right up until antibiotics and modern medicine meant you no longer had to exile the sick to keep everyone else safe. The moment the reason vanished, those islands emptied out too, left to the weeds and the birds, off limits and forgotten. Every one of these places tells the identical story. The island did a job that only isolation could do, and then the world invented a way to do that job without the island. And that leads to the darkest one of all, the island America never even tried to fix. Out in Long Island Sound sits Hart Island, and it's still doing its job. Since the 1860s, it has been New York's Potter's Field, the burial ground for the unclaimed, the unidentified, and the poor. More than 1 million bodies lie there now, in mass graves dug for generations by inmates from Rikers. Roughly 1,000 coffins going into the ground every single year. It's the largest mass grave in the United States, and for most of its history, you couldn't even visit. Here's the haunting part. The island is eroding, and the sea has started pulling the dead back out. In one recent stretch, officials collected 174 human bones off the shoreline where they tumbled from the ground. The countries forgotten are being unburied by the tide. Step back, and you can see what really happened here. America built these islands to handle everything it wanted out of sight and out of mind. The foreign sorted at Ellis. The enemy held off at Governor's. The sick quarantined. The dead and the unwanted buried at Hart. For a century or more, that was the most valuable thing an island could offer. A place to put whatever the mainland didn't want to look at. And then, one by one, the reasons disappeared. New laws, new weapons, new medicine, new priorities. The jobs went away, but the islands couldn't. Land can't move. So it just sat there, too expensive to use and too loaded with history to bulldoze, slowly going back to ruin. So go back to that harbor one more time. From the deck of the ferry, you can see them all. Ellis Island, half restored, half still rotting. Governor's Island, a ghost town that sold for the price of a candy bar. Hart Island, giving up its bones to the water. These are, by the numbers, some of the most valuable views in the entire country. And they sit mostly empty. Not because the land failed, not because anybody made a dumb mistake. They were abandoned because they succeeded so completely that the country outgrew the need for them. And an island, unlike almost anything else America owns, cannot pick up and follow the money. America didn't abandon its most valuable islands because they lost their worth. It abandoned them because their greatest strength was that you could never easily leave. That was the entire point, right up until the day it wasn't.